Hello, my name is Joanna Lemley, and I'm a wetland ecologist with the Colorado Natural Heritage Program at Colorado State University. The following presentation will define the target population used by the Field Protocol for Lentic, Riparian, and Wetland Systems and the BLM's Lentic AIM program. This video presentation supplements information provided in Section 1.2 of the draft protocol, starting on page 11. The Field Protocol for Lentic, Riparian, and Wetland Systems is intended for vegetated riparian and wetland areas, which are also called lentic areas. As explained in the presentation introducing the Lentic AIM program, the applicable ecosystems are further refined by water depth and size for practical application in the field. For Lentic AIM, the general target population is the same as the applicable ecosystems outlined in the protocol. However, specific management questions may further refine the target population for a specific project by other attributes, like wetland type or a specific zone of interest within a wetland. There are three key words or phrases in the target population definition that warrant additional explanation. Those are riparian areas, wetlands, and lentic areas. Aquatic resources are highly varied. The defining characteristic of aquatic resources is water in its many forms and pathways. Water enters a watershed as snow or rain and moves through the landscape, either rapidly in stream channels or more slowly if infiltrated into the groundwater or pooled in ponds, lakes, and marshes. As water moves across, under, and through the landscape, it influences vegetation and creates a wide variety of habitats. As humans, it is our instinct to classify and categorize this diversity into manageable boxes. Classification bounds the range of variation and is useful for inventory, mapping, assessment, monitoring, and management. There are a variety of words used to describe and classify aquatic resources. A separate presentation later in the week will explore the major classification systems in more detail. Today, I will focus on the broadest concepts that are used to define the Lentic AIM target population: riparian areas, wetlands, and lentic areas. I will start with riparian areas. There are several recognized definitions for riparian areas. Shown on this slide is the definition used by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the purpose of mapping riparian areas from aerial photography. This definition states, riparian areas are plant communities contiguous to and affected by surface and subsurface hydrology of rivers, streams, lakes, or drainage ways. Riparian areas have one or both of the following characteristics. 1, distinctively different vegetation than adjacent areas, or 2, similar species to adjacent areas, but exhibiting more robust or vigorous growth forms. Riparian areas can be transitional between wetland and upland. The characteristics of riparian areas are thus water. Riparian areas are contiguous to water bodies, including rivers, streams, and lakes, and they are affected by their hydrology. Plants. Riparian areas are plant communities with different species composition from surrounding uplands, or at least showing more robust growth. Soils. Riparian soils are influenced by the movement of water, but do not necessarily show the chemical and physical properties of hydric soils, which I will explain in just a minute. Publications from other agencies use slightly different words to describe riparian areas. This slide contains 3 other definitions. Each of these definitions includes proximity and influence of surface water and the resulting vegetation community. But most of these definitions are not accompanied by clear guidance on how to delineate riparian areas in the field. There is greater precision and agreement around the definition of wetlands, largely because wetlands are a regulated resource, and it is imperative that people across the country share a common understanding of how to delineate wetland boundaries. This slide shows the definition of wetlands used by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in their Wetland Delineation Manual for regulatory purposes. This definition states, wetlands are those areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support, and under normal circumstances do support, a prevalence of vegetation typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. The characteristics of wetlands are thus water. Wetlands are defined by the frequency and duration of inundation or saturation. This is called wetland hydrology and is generally considered, and a minimum is generally considered to be 15 consecutive days of inundation or saturation, though it can be much longer. We will be discussing wetland hydrology in more detail in another presentation. Plants, wetlands are defined by hydrophytic or water-loving vegetation. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Army Corps of Engineers has developed and continues to refine the National Wetland Plant List that includes a wetland indicator status rating for any plant that occurs in wetlands. Hydrophytic vegetation is specifically defined by communities dominated by obligate fac-wet and facultative plant species. Soils. Wetland soils are called hydric soils, and they have chemical and physical characteristics that reflect inundation and saturation. The Natural Resources Conservation Service of the U.S. Department of Agriculture has developed a list of hydric soil indicators that can be observed and used to define wetland boundaries. Those include features like accumulated organic matter, reddish reduxamorphic concentrations, or pale gray or glade soils. We will be discussing hydric soils in more detail in another presentation. It can be helpful to think about riparian areas and wetlands as two overlapping spheres. Some riparian areas are not wetland because they are not wet long enough to develop wetland soils, so they do not have wetland hydrology or hydric soils. Those include areas along confined streams with little soil development, or more mesic floodplains like cottonwood galleries that are flooded only periodically. In contrast, some wetlands are fed only by groundwater or very temporary water and are not associated with a water body. Whether these sites are also considered riparian areas depends on the definition being used, but many of them may not be considered riparian areas. And then there are many sites that are both wetland and riparian areas. Those include wider riparian shrublands, oxbows and sloughs on floodplains, and wetlands along the margins of lakes or ponds. The target population for lentic AIM includes both spheres and their intersection. Riparian and wetland areas and their adjacent water bodies can be further divided into lotic and lentic systems based on the energy of water movement. Lotic systems are associated with moving water. They are high energy systems with defined channels, though they can also be associated with broad open floodplains. The channel is an open conduit for carrying flowing water, dissolved and suspended material, and the emphasis on the lotic system is on the channel and its processes. All lotic systems are riparian, and some contain or are adjacent to wetlands. In contrast, lentic systems are associated with still or slowly moving water. They are lower energy systems that occur in basins, on slopes, or on flats. They can be associated with ponds and lakes and can occur on floodplains, such as oxbows and beaver ponds and broad riparian shrublands, in which case they may be located adjacent to a lotic channel. But any channel within the actual lentic area are slow-moving with diffuse edges. Most, but not all, lentic systems are wetlands, and some are within riparian areas. The lentic AIM target population only includes lentic, riparian, and wetland systems. Lotic and lentic systems can occur independently or together. The top photo shows sites that have both a lentic and lotic component, while the bottom photos show lotic sites without a lentic component. Because wetlands are regulated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Environmental Protection Agency under the Federal Clean Water Act, many tools and resources have been developed to identify their boundaries. Though the lentic AIM target population of riparian and wetland areas is broader than wetlands alone, these tools can still help. For an area to be delineated as a wetland, there must be positive identification of 3 criteria: wetland hydrology, hydrophytic vegetation, and hydric soils. To meet the lentic AIM target population, only hydrophytic vegetation is needed, but the other 2 provide important information about the site. To help practitioners delineate wetlands in different regions of the United States, The Army Corps of Engineers developed a series of regional supplements to the Wetland Delineation Manual. These documents include all regionally appropriate information needed to define a wetland. This slide shows two commonly used supplements in the West: the supplement for Western mountains, valleys, and coasts, and the supplement for the arid West. Each supplement is specific to a certain geographic region across the country, as shown in these two maps. As we have mentioned, hydrophytic vegetation is the primary criterion for the lentic aim target population. Sites must be dominated by hydrophytic vegetation, specifically those with a wetland indicator status of obligate, facultative wetland, or facultative. The table shown here and included as Table 1 on page 13 of the protocol describes the wetland indicator status ratings. The regional supplements provide methods for determining dominance of vegetation communities, most notably the dominance test, where more than half of all dominant plant species must be hydrophytes. Hydrology is the key driver of riparian and wetland systems. While sites do not need to have wetland hydrology of 15 consecutive days of inundation or saturation to be included in the lentic aim target population, there must be evidence that the site is influenced by lentic hydrology. Regional supplements contain numerous indicators of hydrology that can be used. These are listed in Appendix G of the protocol. Similarly, sites within the lentic aim target population do not need to have hydric soils. But the soil characteristics observed in the site provide additional clues about the site. USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service has defined several hydric soil indicators for each region in the United States. Regional supplements also contain hydric soil indicators specific to each region, and they are listed in Appendix H of the protocol, along with numerous resources on describing riparian and wetland soils. Offers a preview on hydric soil indicators, which will be covered in a separate presentation. That concludes this presentation defining the lentic aim target population. Thank you for listening.